It's early morning. The air is heavy, warm, thick, with the kind of humidity that makes your shirt stick to your skin before you've even had breakfast. Are heading to work, kids are being dropped off at school, markets are opening for the day. It looks, by every measure, like an ordinary Tuesday. Then the water comes. Not slowly, not like a tide rolling in. It comes the way a bathtub overflows when you've walked away and forgotten. First a trickle, then a sheet, then suddenly you're standing in something you don't understand, and it's already above your knees. Within 6 hours, an entire region is underwater. Roads become rivers. Cars float past storefronts. People climb to their rooftops and wait, some of them for days. By the time the floodwaters recede, thousands of people will have been trapped, dozens will be dead, and a country will be forced to ask a question it had been avoiding for years. How did we let this happen? The world before the water. To understand what broke, you first need to see what it looked like when it was intact. The Ahr Valley in western Germany sits tucked between rolling green hills and the Rhineland-Palatinate region. It's wine country, one of the northernmost red wine regions in the world, actually. Small medieval towns line the banks of the Ahr River. Ahrweiler, Bad Neuenahr, Altenahr. These are towns with cobblestone streets, half-timbered houses that look like they've stood since the 1600s, because many of them have. It's the kind of place tourists drive to on summer weekends, to drink Spitburgunder and sit by the river. The Ahr itself is deceptive in that way. It's a small river, modest. In most stretches, you could throw a stone across it. For most of its history, it has flooded occasionally, the way any river does, but nothing catastrophic. People built close to its banks because that's what people do when water is familiar and manageable. The valley's geography, narrow, hemmed in by hills, made it ideal farmland, ideal for vineyards, ideal for picturesque villages. It also made it a trap. This is July 2021. Germany is in the middle of its first post-pandemic summer. People are cautiously returning to normal. The news that week had been about vaccination rates and reopening plans and a European football championship. Weather was an afterthought. The hidden vulnerability. Here's something that rarely gets discussed when we talk about floods. The ground matters as much as the water. The weeks leading up to July 14th had been unusually wet across much of Europe. The soil in the Ahr Valley was already saturated. It had been raining on and off for most of the month. When soil reaches full saturation, it stops absorbing. Every drop that falls from that point on has nowhere to go but the surface, and from the surface, it flows downhill, and in a narrow valley, downhill means the river. The river's narrow banks, the dense development along its shores, the hills that channel water in rather than spread it out, all of this had been identified as a vulnerability before. A 2003 German government report explicitly warned that the Ahr Valley faced serious flood risk. There were studies, there were recommendations, there were committees. None of it translated into meaningful infrastructure changes, meaningful early warning systems, or meaningful public preparedness. Part of this is bureaucratic inertia. Part of it is cost. But a large part of it was something more human. The river had never done anything truly catastrophic in living memory. It was hard to justify expensive flood barriers against a risk that felt theoretical. People who live alongside a small, quiet river for decades stop seeing the river as dangerous. It becomes scenery. That assumption was about to be tested in the worst possible way. The first signals. On the afternoon of July 13th, the German Weather Service issued a warning for extreme rainfall across parts of western Germany and Belgium. The word they used was extreme. Not heavy, not significant, extreme. The warning reached emergency management offices. It reached local governments. What it did not do, in any consistent or effective way, was reach the people who needed it most. Residents in low-lying areas along rivers like the Ahr. Cell phone alerts, which in Germany are broadcast through a system called Cell Broadcast, were not yet operational in July 2021. Germany had actually decommissioned its old siren network years earlier, without fully replacing it. There was a National Warning Day test in 2020 that had famously failed. Alarms didn't go off, apps didn't trigger, and the whole event became a national joke rather than a wake-up call. A year later, those gaps were still there. In the valley, some people noticed the river rising that afternoon. A few businesses near the water started moving things to upper floors. A handful of local officials tried to organize informal warnings, but there was no coordinated evacuation, no sirens. For most residents, the first real signal was the water itself, by which point it was far too late to do anything calmly. When the valley became a channel, by the evening of July 14th, the storm system had stalled directly over the region. This is the meteorological detail that made everything worse. The low-pressure system wasn't moving. It just sat there, pulling in moisture and dropping it in the same place, hour after hour. In a 24-hour period, parts of the Ahr Valley received more than 100 millimeters of rain. Some stations recorded closer to 150. To put that in context, the region's average rainfall for the entire month of July is around 70 millimeters. It received double that in a single night. The Ahr River, which normally flows at around 20 cubic meters per second, peaked at somewhere between 700 and 900 cubic meters per second. That's not a flood. That's a different river, a completely different body of water occupying the same geography with none of the same rules. It hit the towns and the valley like a physical object, not a surge, a wall. Witnesses described a roar before the water arrived, the sound of a river suddenly present where a river had no business being. Cars were picked up and carried. Buildings that had stood for 400 years were undercut and collapsed into the current. An entire campsite near Schuld, where people had pitched tents for a summer holiday, was simply gone. The campsite had been warned, but the evacuation hadn't been completed in time. Trapped. Let's talk about what being trapped in a flood actually means, because it's not what most people imagine. You don't just get wet. The water comes with force. It carries debris, wood, metal, furniture, vehicles. Moving through it is nearly impossible because the current is strong enough to knock a healthy adult off their feet in knee-deep water. And in the Ahr Valley that night, the water wasn't knee-deep. In places, it was 4, 5, 6 meters above normal river level. Streets that people walked every day had 8 feet of fast-moving water running through them. People climbed. They went to upper floors, attic spaces, rooftops. They called emergency services, but the emergency services were themselves being overwhelmed. Roads were impassable, bridges had been destroyed or were too dangerous to use, and the scope of the disaster was unfolding simultaneously across hundreds of square kilometers. First responders couldn't reach most of the people who needed help. In the town of Sinzig, 12 residents of a care facility for people with disabilities drowned because the building flooded before anyone could evacuate them. 12 people, in their beds, in a place that was supposed to be safe. That detail is hard to sit with. Across the valley, people spent the night on rooftops in the dark, in the rain, listening to the water below them, waiting. No phone signal in some areas. No power. No way to know if help was coming or how long they had. What the morning showed by dawn on July 15th, the rain had stopped. The water began to pull back. What it left behind is difficult to describe. The towns along the Ahr looked like they'd been shaken in a jar. Cars were stacked on top of each other. Trees had been driven through building walls. The bridge in Ahrweiler, a stone arch bridge that had survived 2 world wars, was destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were buried under meters of mud and debris. The smell, survivors said, was something they couldn't place at first. Soil, fuel, decay, all of it mixed together and baked in the July heat. The official death toll across Germany and Belgium reached 222 people. More than 130 of those deaths were in the Ahr Valley alone. It was the deadliest natural disaster Germany had experienced in over half a century. 40,000 people were left without power. The water infrastructure, pipes, treatment facilities, was extensively damaged. Whole villages had no road access for days. In some areas, weeks. The failures that followed the water. In the weeks after, an uncomfortable question moved from whispers to headlines. Could more people have survived with better warnings? The answer, by most independent assessments, is yes. The European Flood Awareness System had issued alerts days before the event. Meteorological models were accurate. They predicted extreme rainfall in exactly the areas where it occurred. The information existed. The failure was in translation. Translating data into public warnings. Translating warnings into action. Translating the word extreme into something concrete enough that a person would leave their home. Germany subsequently accelerated the rollout of cell broadcast alerts, tested them successfully in September 2021, and has continued to update its emergency warning infrastructure. There have been parliamentary inquiries, commissions, reforms. Some of this will matter in the next emergency. Some of it arrived too late for the families of 222 people. The broader picture is harder to avoid. Climate scientists have been clear for years that extreme precipitation events, the kind where a storm stalls and dumps weeks of rainfall in hours, are becoming more frequent as the atmosphere warms. This isn't a distant threat. It's an operational reality that infrastructure built in calmer decades isn't equipped for. The Ahr Valley flood wasn't a freak accident. It was a collision between a foreseeable risk and a system unprepared to respond to it. Why this still matters. Here's the part that's easy to miss when you read disaster coverage. These events don't stay local. The 2021 floods across Western Europe caused an estimated 40 to 50 billion euros in damage. That's insurance claims, infrastructure repair, economic disruption across entire regions. It changes property values. It changes where people choose to live and build. It changes how governments prioritize infrastructure spending for years afterward. But more than any of that, it is a template. Not a unique catastrophe, but a model of how these events unfold. Accurate forecasts exist, warnings are inconsistent, people without the ability to evacuate quickly bear the worst of it, and the aftermath reveals systemic gaps that were already documented and underaddressed. This pattern has repeated itself in Pakistan, in Libya, in Brazil, in the Philippines. Different geography, different infrastructure levels, different scales of death and displacement, but the same underlying logic. Water that the ground cannot absorb, infrastructure that cannot contain it, and warning systems that don't reach the people who need them in time. The Ahr Valley is one data point. It's a very well-documented, very visible, very expensive data point in a long series of events that are only going to increase in frequency. What we should take from this. First, early warning systems are not a technical luxury. They are emergency infrastructure as essential as roads or hospitals. Germany's failure to maintain an effective warning system in 2021 was a policy failure, not a technology failure. The tools existed. They weren't deployed. Second, saturation matters. Flood risk isn't just about rainfall intensity. It's about what the land can absorb. Soil moisture, land use, upstream conditions. These are factors that change a heavy rain into a catastrophe. Disaster planning that ignores antecedent conditions is incomplete planning. Third, vulnerable populations don't evacuate themselves. The 12 people who died in Sinzig weren't caught off guard by sudden water. They were in a building, cared for by staff, in a town that had hours of warning. The gap between a warning and an actual evacuation for people who can't move quickly is enormous, and that gap needs to be planned for specifically. Fourth, the documentation was there. The 2003 report, the 2020 warning system failure, the European flood alerts. None of this was secret. The problem was that known risks, without political urgency or public pressure, tend to stay on shelves. Closing. There's a version of this story that ends with the floodwaters receding, the cameras leaving, and the valley slowly, painfully rebuilding. And that version is real. The Ahr Valley is recovering. Vineyards replanted, streets repaved, some of the old buildings restored. Life does return. But there's another version of this story that runs alongside it, quieter and more uncomfortable. It's the version where nothing that caused this has been solved, not globally, not fundamentally, where the same combination of saturated soil, narrow valleys, inadequate warnings, and warming-driven weather extremes is waiting to converge somewhere else. The water doesn't know we've had this conversation. What we do with that knowledge is the only part that's still up to us. A flood is not just water. It is everything a place failed to prepare for, made visible all at once.